I would like to begin with a question, a rhetorical question. What is the most important Buddhist teaching? And of course, saying that, it's a little odd question, isn't it? It's like we know that Buddhism emphasizes the interdependence of all things, but that also applies to the Buddhist teachings themselves. They all seem of a whole, where each teaching is connected and dependent on the other teachings. Um, Although, and especially I think in the Zen world, uh, if the whole point of the Buddhist teachings is to help us let go, open up, realize something, then we could say, well, whatever the turning word is, whatever the teaching that helps us do that, that would be the most important teaching, but at that time. So, what seems like the most important teaching for me or for any of us at one time might be very different at another time, very different for you and very different for me. Nonetheless, and I'm sure you could see this coming, um, there is a particular teaching that I would like to highlight, and I would like to approach it in a kind of an indirect way by starting off with the most famous story in the Buddhist tradition, which is, of course, the story of the future Buddha's life. I'm pretty sure almost all of us are quite familiar with that. Um, Evidently, and we can't know for sure just how much of this is myth, maybe all of it, and yet in a way it doesn't matter. It's one of those truths that is true whether or not it happened. But anyway, according to the story, the the future Buddha must have led a very protected life because he was really shocked when he finally encountered an old person, presumably never seen one before, an ill person, and finally a dead person, a corpse. And the shock of this was so great, this is going to happen to me too. That's what sort of shook him out of his comfortable princely life and sent him into the forest on his spiritual quest. And there he studied with a couple teachers, tried ascetic practices, and eventually went off and sat by himself, ending up under a Bodhi tree next to a little river, where he had, according to the tradition, he had this great awakening. And what happened after that? Well, apparently he taught for about 45 years. He got old, he got sick, and he died. So, how did he solve the problem? In what way did he solve the problem? In a lot of conventional religious traditions, the way he solved it is that he realized, that there's something that doesn't die, that there's a pure soul that survives, goes to heaven, or something like that. But that's not the way that Buddhism talks. That's not the Buddhist understanding. Rather, long before his physical death, under that Bodhi tree, the Buddha had some great realization about his true nature. And one of the ways we sometimes try to describe that is the realization that because from the essential point of view, he was never born, he can't die. It's realizing that essential nature. Another way to talk about it is to emphasize the Buddhist teaching about non-self or no self. Um, the claim, quite extraordinary. I mean, if you think about it, just about unique in the world's great spiritual traditions, that there's no such thing as a self, right? A separate self. That the feeling that there's a me inside and the rest of you and the rest of the world is outside me, that sense of duality, that sense of separation or opposition, that is in fact a delusion. In fact, the most problematical delusion of all. And that's what really leaps out for me. That's what I find myself coming back to again and again. This claim, and curiously, you don't find it expressed in quite this way in the earliest teachings, the Pali Canon, but basically what it's saying is that this sense of self, the sense of separate self, is not only delusion, but it's at the very core of our dukkha, of our suffering. Dukkha being the word, of course, for the word that's usually translated into English as suffering, but we have to understand it in the broadest possible sense. Dissatisfaction, frustration, anxiety, dis-ease. So that to me is frankly the single most important Buddhist teaching that I keep coming back to. This relationship between the delusion of a separate self and the fact that there's a dukkha, a suffering built into that delusion. In some ways, I think we're in a better situation now to understand what the Buddha was pointing at, given what we've learned from sort of modern psychology. In more modern language, we can say that the sense of self is a construct, a psychological and social construct. It's not something that infants are born with. It's actually something that develops as we grow up. Our caregivers look into our eyes, give us a name that we learn to identify with, and also basically we learn to see ourselves as they see us. We internalize that, which is why we are so preoccupied with what other people think about that. We learn to use language in certain ways: I, me, mine, you, yours, his, hers, and so forth. That's all very essential to it. So we could say that the sense of self is, being a construct, it's composed of mostly habitual ways of thinking, feeling, acting, reacting, remembering, planning, intending. It's the way that these mostly habitual processes work together, reinforce each other. But does that give us insight into what the fundamental problem is? I think it does. And here's what it is, as I understand it. Because the sense of self is a construct, because it doesn't refer, it doesn't depend on, it doesn't point back to a real self that has any, self-reality or self-identity. This sense of self, by virtue of its lack of essence, is inherently uncomfortable. We can say it's basically inherently insecure. In fact, it's not only insecure, but it's insecurable in the sense that there's nothing there that could be secured. And here's the important point. I think we experience that. We experience it as a sense of lack. That is to say, the sense that something is wrong with me, something is missing, something isn't quite right. I'm not good enough. And the reality is, I think all of us to some degree have some sense of that, some sense of lack, even though we might ignore it or cover it up. There's some sense of that. But because it's mostly sort of unconscious in the sense that we don't really know where it comes from, we're parents, language, society keeps reassuring us we're real. And this claim that there's a kind of unreality at our core, that's pushed away. But nonetheless, it comes up, I'm saying. You can call it the return of the repressed. It comes up as this sense of lack, sense of inadequacy. But how it is that we're going to understand it is, what it is that we lack, there's a lot of different possibilities there. It seems to me that in times past, say in more traditional, more religious times, say medieval Europe, I wonder if that explains a lot of the attraction of religion, that religion promises us that we'll be okay, that our sense of lack will be filled up. But what about our stronger sense of individuality today without that security of believing, that in fact everything will turn out okay? How do we differently then understand our sense of lack today? Especially, I think, in the United States, which has, we're so individualistic. Has there ever been a more individualistic society? Which is another way of saying that our sense of separate self is much stronger than it has been in most other societies where family and friend, you know, extended families and such would be much more supportive. One would think of oneself more as a member, as a part of that. But we're so individualized. And if we can say that the sense of lack is something which shadows the sense of self, and we have such a stronger sense of separate self, we can see how the sense of lack too would be very strong. And then we need to ask ourselves, how do people who are very individuated, how do they understand their sense of lack? I think it's pretty obvious in a way what we're talking about here. In the United States, I mean, I don't think it's very difficult to think of some very big, some very strong examples of how that works. Um, just growing up in this society, one of the main things that we learn pretty quickly is that we don't have enough money, right? And in a way, it doesn't matter how much money we have, it's not enough, that we always need more. Um, not only the money, but all the sort of consumer toys that go along with it. There's the sense of competition. We want to have a better car or a better house than, say, the neighbor or the person that we compare ourselves with. I think that goes to the core of a lot of the American dream. But of course, that's not the only sort of lack project. That's my term for it. That out of this sense of lack, not quite understanding what's going on, we look for something outside ourselves, thinking that if only I get enough money or whatever, then that will fill up that bottomless core, that bottomless pit at the core of my being. And money is one of those. But the irony, of course, is that if this desire, if this craving for money, if this lack project, and we could also call it reality project, because another way to talk about all this is to say that we don't feel real enough, and we're looking for that which somehow will make us feel more real, more complete, more whole, right? Uh, because whatever the lack project may be, it is looking for something outside that's going to secure this sense of self inside. The tragedy of the whole process, of course, is that it doesn't matter how much money you earn, it's never going to be enough, because what we're dealing with is just a symptom and not the core problem. Now, I need to add to that, of course, that doesn't mean that for many people, there's generally not enough money, okay, given the way our economic system functions. I mean, I don't mean to negate that in any way. I'm talking more about, middle class, upper middle class, this how the preoccupation with making money becomes a kind of a lack project. Certainly, we need money to survive in this society. Another really important example, I think, which has been especially true, maybe just in the last generation or so. We spend so most of us so much time looking at screens. It used to be television screens and occasionally cinema, but now thanks to the internet, we spend so much time every day, often looking, well, like we're doing right now, right? Looking at me, looking at other people, and interacting in that way. Often it's not interacting, though. Often it's just taking in what somebody else is saying or doing. And one interesting thing about that is how on these screens, as well as in magazines and newspapers and so forth, it tends to be the same sorts of people who reappear, right? The A-list Hollywood celebrities. It's politicians, those who are very good at finding ways to grab attention to themselves, and I'll leave that nameless. But that there's a whole core of people who tend to recur, right? The influencers, etc., etc. So we tend to see the same people cropping up, and there's an interesting kind of contrast. These people, they have so much presence, everyone sees them, whereas me, I'm I'm kind of nobody. I don't have that kind of a presence. And the way I think that translates is the sense that, to be famous, as Freud put it, to be loved by many anonymous people, but at least to be known by many anonymous people, that somehow that would give me a kind of sense of reality. And, I must be real. But again, it's the same problem. I don't think it's hard to think of examples of, say, famous people, like maybe some pop stars who become rather too famous too early, and somehow that destroys them. They don't know how to deal with that. Maybe they expect, they have the desire, but once it actually happens, it doesn't it doesn't give them what maybe they are hoping from it. In other words, in our language, it doesn't fill up their sense of lack. It doesn't make them feel more real, and often they seem to go off the rails. They can't cope with that. There are many other examples. I mean, there's many ways to reflect on this. Romance, love. Maybe this functions a little bit differently now than it did, say, I'm pretty sure the story is a little different than it was, say, between my mother and my son, right? I think my mother was still that generation where if you just meet that right person, there's somebody out there, and if you just find them, then there's this myth, and they're going to complete you, and they're going to be your perfect other half, and everything will go okay, everything will be right. Your problem is solved, right? Whereas I think most of us here, already know the hard way that your problems may be just beginning, right? There's no guarantee that that kind of, and you can see how when one has those very romantic expectations about the other person, how that puts a pressure on the other person. The expectations, if they're going to fill up my sense of lack, they have to be a certain way. And of course, again, going back to the fact that that other person, it's not to say that romance and sex and all of that isn't wonderful, but nonetheless, the idea that that other person is going to fill up your sense of lack, that's an unfortunate expectation that's going to that's going to tend to create problems. Anyway, there's a number of other things one can point to. Another one that, again, I think it's a little bit different now in the last generation or two, where we have what we're being called metrosexuals. I don't know if that's still true, but our own bodies, right? I mean, certainly through a lot of my lifetime, there's been a lot more pressure, a lot more internalized pressure among women to have a beautiful body, right? To be attractive, to be thin, to be sexy. And I think that's a not uncommon lack project, which I think sort of tends to create, these problems of eating disorders, right? I remember I once read an interview somewhere with some supermodel. Can I remember her name? Christy somebody? Anyway, it doesn't matter. But what struck me about it was that she was clearly obsessed by the fact that, on somewhere on her upper thigh or backside, she had a little bit of cellulite that she couldn't seem to get rid of. In other words, she was always somebody who was widely perceived as one of the most beautiful people on the planet, and yet that still bothered her so much that that wasn't beautiful enough for her. Again, I think, exemplifying the fact that, you know, anything that is our lack project, if it's something external, including our bodies, the way we relate to them, then they're not going to be good enough. If your body is your lack project, your body is never going to be perfect enough. One can go on and on. Even more simply, what's the attraction of alcohol and other sort of recreational drugs? Well, one of the nice things about alcohol, you have a couple drinks, and guess what? You can relax. Your sense of lack sort of tends to disappear for a little while, right? And it gets easier for me if I'm sitting at a bar and there's a pretty girl next to me, right? Well, maybe that self-consciousness before that would, what should I do? What should I say? Well, now I'm kind of relaxed, and it's easier. You're not so afraid of making a fool of yourself. And likewise, recreational drugs, I think, are good examples. What they really point to is they are, I mean, so much of their attraction is they temporarily manage to help us forget this sense of lack. I'm reminded of something Dr. Johnson, the 18th century writer. He was once at a he was once at a kind of a party. I don't know the details of the party, but it was getting kind of crazy. And the hostess spoke to him and said, "I wonder what pleasure men can take in becoming beasts or making beasts of themselves." And Dr. Johnson said, "It gets rid of the pain of being a man." Or in less sexist language, it gets rid of the pain of being human. It helps us let go of it for a while. Anyway, I hope that this makes some sense, because this is a pretty significant, I think, perspective. Certainly, once this became clear to me in terms of how I understood why people did what they did, it did seem to change things, and also why I was pretended to be preoccupied with the things that I often was. But I do want to point out one more really significant implication here, which is how it affects our experience of time. It's the nature of lack projects, insofar as we become preoccupied with them, that they tend to be future oriented naturally. I mean, the whole idea of a lack project or a reality project is right here, right now is not good enough, because I feel this sense of inadequacy, this sense of lack. But in the future, when I have what I think I need, when I'm rich enough or famous enough, or my body is perfect enough, or whatever, when I have all this, then everything will be okay. And what, of course, that does is that future orientation traps us in linear time in a way that tends to devalue the way we experience the world and ourselves in the world right here and now, right? It treats the now as a means to some better ends. Now isn't good enough, but when I have what I think I need, everything is going to be just great. So many of the spiritual traditions end up especially the mystics, right? And the Zen masters, right? They end up talking about what is sometimes called the eternal now or the eternal present. A different way of experiencing the now. As long as the present is a means to some better end, this future when I'm going to be okay, then the present is experienced as as a series of nows that fall away, right? As we reach for that future. But if we're not actually needing to get somewhere that's better in the future, it's possible to experience the here and now as lacking nothing, and myself in the here and now as lacking nothing. It's possible to experience the present as something that doesn't arise and doesn't fall away. In Buddhism, we're so familiar with the emphasis on impermanence, the idea that everything that arises passes away. But what's the one thing that doesn't? It's always now. And the fact that we don't realize that, why? It's so obvious. And yet we tend to overlook that because we're trying to get to that place that we think we need to get to. Anyway, I hope that this makes some sense. What about the Buddha Dharma? What about the path of Buddhism? Well, that too I would call a lack project, a reality project. The difference is that it's a lack project that can actually work. Doesn't always. I think for some people it stays that at that same level of, trying to get somewhere. People can still plug the Buddhist path into that. But the basic idea is that, to say it like this, if the sense of lack is the shadow that haunts the sense of self, well, what happens if through our practice we can let go, open up, let go of this sense of self that Dogen, for example, talked about? By letting go, seeing through the delusion of a separate self, then we also let go, see through the delusion of lack. I'm sure most of us here are so familiar with this famous quotation from Dogen, Genja Koan, in his Shobogenzo, where he just sums it up so perfectly. To study the Buddha Dharma is to study the self. Study in the sense of inquire into. To study the Buddha Dharma is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to realize your intimacy with the 10,000 things, your interrelationship, your non-duality with all things, right? So we can understand that's what the meditation process is all about. What's going on when we're meditating? Well, obviously things come to mind. All these habitual ways of thinking and feeling, etc., they come into the mind. But if we're meditating, we learn not to cling to them, but let them go. They'll arise and they'll pass away. And in the process of doing that, basically what's happening is that the sense of separate self is deconstructing. It's not that we're doing it because we're the sense of a me or a self. It's not that the self is deconstructing itself, but the meditation is actually how you can say it's happening. And then what we call kensho, or some opening, some taste of enlightenment, happens some moment when that sense of self really does evaporate or disappear to some degree for a moment, for a while, anyway. A good time to sip some tea. We can ask, so what does all this have to do? What does it imply about a lot of the social issues that we face today? And I would like to sort of follow up here by basically talking about how everything that I've said about our individual predicament, what Buddhism has traditionally said. In other words, what I've offered so far is really my take, my way of presenting what I think is the essential Buddhist teaching here. What I find absolutely fascinating is the parallel between that and the ecological crisis right now. And I'd like to finish my talk just by talking a little bit about that. There's more in the Eco-Dharma book for anyone who is interested. But in fact, it seems to me that if we really understand what Buddhism is saying, about the sense of self and the issues there, I think we can see the ecological crisis is really just a larger version of the same thing, the macrocosm of the microcosm. Because we have not only individual senses of self, right? We also have collective senses of self, right? Um, I'm not just David. I'm a man, not a woman. Um, I'm white. I'm not a person of color. I'm American. I'm not Canadian or Mexican, etc., etc. But in this case, it refers to the largest collective sense of self, which is what it means to be a human being, at least a human being in its present form, part of this, now global civilization that we have finally achieved in the last century or go. Ironically, a civilization that does seem to be in the process of self-destructing. But just as the fundamental problem on the individual level is the delusion of a separate self, so on the collective level, it's the same thing. And I guess just this needs to be stressed again and again, because the ecological crisis, it's not just a technological problem or an economic problem or a political problem. Fundamentally, I think it's a spiritual problem because it has to do with our collective relationship with the earth. Just as individually we feel this sense of separation, so we as a species feel this sense of separation. And if we're ever going to really resolve the problem, I think it's going to be necessary for us to come to some kind of new understanding of that relationship, right? Where it gets interesting is if you ask about things like lack projects or reality projects. On the individual level, I was talking about how the separation is a delusion, it's uncomfortable, we become preoccupied with trying to find something out here that'll fill up our sense of lack. And, we can wonder, is there something comparable at the civilizational level? And frankly, I think that there is. I think that it is our collective preoccupation with progress. Although interestingly, I think that collective lack project may not be working so well anymore. Certainly it was pretty active when I was born, right? Post-war, the world is getting better, economically, politically. Yeah, you got a Cold War, but nonetheless, things are going to get better and better. And it's that same relationship with time, whatever problems there are now, everything is going to be okay in the future. And unfortunately, of course, um, given especially the ecological crisis, I think it's harder and harder to believe in that light project. And I wonder whether that disturbance in the lack project is actually contributing to some of the manic quality, to some of the crazy quality that I think many of us feel today, just reading about all these crazy shootings and the incredible divisions politically as well as economically. If there's a parallel on the level of lack projects, we can also ask, well, so what about the solution, right? On the individual Buddhist level, we have something like meditation. We have ways to deconstruct, as it were, the sense of separate self. What's going on the collective level? And I think that's a really good question, and something that I think this is at the least a very important part of the solution. Paul Hawken, many years ago, wrote a pretty important book called Blessed Unrest. And what's fascinating about that book is that he says there's something going on now that's never happened before in human history, that there are a very large number of organizations, groups that are springing up, most of them small, right? Nonprofit, uh, oftentimes very localized, to save that stand of trees threatened by a flyover or something. But so many groups of people springing up to work for social justice and sustainability. He says, I think he originally estimated maybe up as many as like 1.5 million, but now I think he would say well over 2 million. And again, this is not something that's ever happened before in human history. And the thing I particularly love about that book is the point he makes about this can be understood, this rising up almost spontaneously of all of these groups of people, to help heal our society and our relationship to the natural world. He says, this is actually the immune system of the earth. This is how the earth is trying to heal itself. And this is how, when those of us who are trying to contribute to this, we are really part of this immune system. Notice that the immune system is always, like in our own bodies, the immune system is part of our body. It's not separate from the body, right? It's how the body heals itself. To say that we are part of the immune system of the earth is to say the earth is acting through us, in us, as us, through us. That this is in a way how we heal our relationship, is opening up to that when we're responding in a non-selfish way to that urge, when we open, how to say this, if it is the immune system, you can see how that implies that when we are doing this, the whole presupposition, the whole context is it's because we are non-dual with the earth, that we are not separate from it. That's no guarantee of success, as Hawken himself emphasizes. Immune systems can fail, right? Remember HIV, AIDS? So that in itself, we don't know what the result will be, but it does emphasize our non-duality and the possibilities there. Instead of these lack projects of indefinite economic growth, right? More and more money, of more and more technological progress. Instead of getting caught up in that, we have this alternative where we can see that the great challenge for us today, the great challenge facing us, is this need for playing our role in this healing process. It's interesting when you go back historically and you look at the archaic civilizations, the oldest civilizations, say before Christianity, what's quite striking is they all felt that they were, they didn't feel that they were separate. They felt that their political and religious systems were, in fact, just as natural as the ecosystems that they were embedded within. It was all part of the same thing. And one of the important implications for all of them that I've been able to study is the belief that as part of that ecosystem, their civilizations, they had a role to play in keeping the cosmos working. And often that came out in a way that we wouldn't necessarily like. It often involves sacrifices. Think of the Aztecs, and the one thing most of us know about them is that they like to sacrifice large numbers of war captives to the sun god. Why? Well, that was necessary to keep the sun god on his way. I think it was a male god, right? And that if you didn't do it, the sun god, I don't know if he would get angry or lose his way, whatever, but that was essential to keep the cosmos working. And a lot of our dukkha today, I think, can be understood as a result of this sense of separation. If human beings, if we're not part of something greater than ourselves, if we don't have a role to play, if we're just accidents of evolution, then what's the whole point of life? Maybe we're just, all we can do is enjoy ourselves, have fun, if we can, while we can, as long as we can, until we die. Whereas I think what we're seeing now with the ecological crisis and all of the other aspects of the poly crisis is that it's becoming clear that collectively, we have an important role to play. I'm constantly thinking of something, Noam Chomsky said a couple of years ago. He said that this is the most dangerous time in human history. The most dangerous time in human history. If you put together the ecological crisis, nuclear weapons, the decline of democracy, rise of authoritarianism, which are the things that he cited. I'm a bit of a history buff, so I tried to think of a counterexample, and I couldn't. He's right. This is the most dangerous time in human history. And one of the implications of that for those of us on the Buddhist path is, what does that mean for how we understand and practice Buddhism? It's really important that we don't understand our path as simply a matter of individual enlightenment, individual awakening, with a kind of indifference what's going on to the larger order. And here, of course, we return to, I think, the most important thing that Buddhism has to offer, which is the Bodhisattva path, or as I like to say, the Ecosattva path, the new Bodhisattva path, because I think we need to understand the Bodhisattva activity in a somewhat different way. The whole point of the Bodhisattva path is a double practice. We continue to work on our own awakening with Zazen, etc., but we know that that's insufficient, it's also really important to help other people. And ultimately, that's because at a certain point, we realize that we're not separate from other people. To continue to become preoccupied with our own awakening, our own serenity, after a certain point, that becomes part of the problem. We're just reinforcing the sense of separation. So as we practice, we begin to open up, realize that our own well-being is not separate from the well-being of other people. And we naturally, what's in it for me, that kind of turns around. What can I do? What can I contribute that might actually help in some small way the healing of our earth? But here, I think we need to understand the challenge in a somewhat different way, because the three poisons that Buddhism has always talked about, greed, ill will, and delusion, I think they are now institutionalized. We have to find ways to come together to create stronger sanghas, to work, to contribute what we can in order to challenge these institutionalized three poisons. Problems that the Buddha didn't face, and so we can't simply turn to the Buddhist teachings to get specific answers about what we should do, but that we can use the Buddhist teachings to understand them, and in particular to understand how it is we do what we do. So when I talk about the institutionalization of the three poisons, I mean, it seems to me, if greed, ill will, delusion, if greed means you never have enough, I think that's a pretty good description of corporate consumer neoliberal capitalism, frankly, our economic system. Institutionalized ill will, aversion, aggression. I think there's a lot of things that covers, including our militarism here in the US. Remembering that, despite our paranoia about what other countries might do, our military, the amount of money we spend on our military is what the equivalent of the next 7 or 8 highest nations in the world. And then institutionalized delusion, I used to talk about that in terms of advertising and keeping us consumers. But I think in the last few years, with some of the incredibly manipulative media, and of course, we just found out yesterday or the day before, Fox News admitting, I don't know if they officially admitting responsibility, but had to do this huge payout because of some of the lies that they perpetuated. We have to understand this is a new challenge, a challenge for the Buddhist tradition. It's not sufficient simply to think of individuals helping individuals. we've become a lot better in pulling drowning people out of the river, but we have to ask who or what is pushing them in the river upstream? Why are there so many more drowning people? And frankly, it seems to me that if Buddhism or Buddhists aren't willing to move in that direction, then maybe Buddhism isn't what the world needs right now. But in fact, what I've tried to touch on in some small degree is how I think Buddhism, the Buddhist perspectives, can indeed give us a great deal of insight into the problems we face today and how we might respond to them. Anyway, I realize I've really wandered far astray here, starting out talking about our individual sense of lack, but then trying to tie it into some of the larger social issues that we face. I think this would be a good time for me to stop and open the floor if we have time for some questions or comments.
We'll just see if there's anyone online who would like to ask a question. There's a reactions button at the bottom. You could, I think, unmute yourself and simply begin speaking. That might be also, or if there's anyone in the Zendo here. Yes, Molly.
I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the relationship between the real and the good. I'm having a little bit of trouble understanding the equation of them, because it seems possible to have the sense that one is whole and quite bad. Thank you.
It's interesting that the preeminent Abrahamic Judeo-Christian duality between good and evil is not the way Buddhism thinks, right? In fact, from a Buddhist perspective, you can say that is quite problematical. It's an example of what's called bipolar thinking, where you have two things that we might normally think of as separate from each other, and yet they're actually completely dependent on each other, because the meaning of each is the negation of the other. What do I mean? Like big and small, right? Seems like you have two concepts there, but really it's two sides of the same concept. If you don't know what big is, you don't know what small is, right? And the problem with good and evil, and the reason this is not a foundational Buddhist concept, is that that's a pretty good example of bipolar thinking. That if you become preoccupied, I mean, just think, it's our favorite story, but it's very dangerous, because once you identify something as evil, you don't need to sort of understand it. Rather, if it's really evil, the whole point is to destroy it. And I think that goes back to sort of, the Judeo-Christian idea of Satan or something like that. And historically, this has had enormous implications. If you think, for example, heresy trials, witchcraft trials, how it rationalized the way that Christian Europe colonized the rest of the world, because they were spreading the good, and how important it is to destroy the false religions. But we don't need to go back that far. George W. Bush and Osama bin Laden, I think they're playing the same game, right? What the one thinks is good, the other thinks is evil, but it's both the game of good versus evil, and each trying to destroy the other, leading to the incredible irony that one of the main causes of evil in the world has been our attempts to get rid of evil. Switching gears a little bit very quickly, though, I realized that I didn't emphasize at all. I was speaking more about the wisdom side, and I didn't really talk about what comes along with that, which is the compassion side. I mean, one way to try to summarize what I was saying in the first part of the talk is that wonderful little quotation from Nisargadatta, who said, "When I look inside and see that I am nothing, that's wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that's love." Between these two, my life flows. He's nailed it, wisdom and love, or as we more often say, wisdom and compassion, the two pillars of the Buddhist path. And I think he shows why they fit together so well. Uh, if we have the wisdom of realizing that we're not separate from the world, then, as I alluded to, that turning around of the meaning of our lives, as we see through the delusion of separate self, seeing through the self-obsession and all the problems that creates, there's this natural turning outward concern for the well-being of everyone, and that's what we call compassion. So that's another way to talk about the good, of how I think from a Buddhist perspective, it really flows from the understanding that we're not separate from each other, and therefore our own well-being isn't separate from the well-being of others in the earth, and therefore it feels quite natural to become, quite spontaneous too, to become concerned about that well-being insofar as we begin to wake up and realize that non-duality. Okay, I went off a little bit of a jag there. Does that answer your question?
We have another question online,
Please.
chat. Is it more effective to work for justice within existing organizations, which may, as you suggested, have institutionalized the three poisons, or work as an activist independently from outside our government and conventional non-governmental organizations?
It's a great question. For example, a couple years ago, pre-COVID, I was quite involved in Extinction Rebellion here in the Colorado area. Some of us got arrested blocking a road in Denver, trying to sort of highlight the issue. So that's going outside sort of the official channels, but I don't see that as negating the importance of working institutionally as well. That is to say, trying to get Congress, trying to get the political system to acknowledge. In fact, what I tend to see is how they really depend on each other. It's not a matter of either or, but both, really. I do want to add one more thing here, though, which is to highlight something that the Bodhisattva path emphasizes, the idea of skillful means. And the way I understand that is a lot of emphasis on creativity. I just spoke a couple days ago with someone I met in New York some years ago, and I think he's a wonderful example of that. He started an online group, which basically got people to sign on. It was like a kind of petition, or they signed on by signing on. They took a vow that they wouldn't vote for anyone who accepted corporate donations. And then, he would get a list of several thousand people, and then he would go to the candidates. And I think at this point it was New York assemblymen or assembly people. Excuse me. And he would say, these people want to know, do you accept corporate contributions? Oh, and by the way, there's 25,000 people here, and you only won your last election by about 10 or 15,000 votes. So please let us know, do you accept corporate contributions? And I thought it was brilliant, and it seems like it was having some effect. So, I mean, one can go into some detail about that, but it's really taking advantage of the internet and the possibilities there. And even if somebody accepted corporate money at the very last moment, you could send out an email to all 25,000 people the day before the election and keep them updated. So that to me is a lovely example of upaya kasalya, the skillful means. Sometimes I think that'll involve working through the system. Sometimes it'll involve trying to put pressure by working outside the system. But it seems to me we need both.
Thank you again, David. You've been so generous with your time and your heart and your wisdom. Deep well wishes to you, David. And we look forward to having you at Mountain Cloud in person sometime.
Me too. Thank you all. I'm so sorry I can't be with you in person. Thank
It
you.
was a great gift. Thank you.